Living God's Future Now conversation, hosted by Heart Edge. Heart Edge is an ecumenical movement for church renewal arising out of St Martin in the Fields in London, now on 4 continents globally, that believes renewal of the heart comes from the edge and seeks to catalyse kingdom communities through the 4 C's of commerce, culture, compassion, and congregational life. Since last May, we've been running a continuous festival of theology and practice, of which this monthly second Thursday conversation is the flagship event. Please see the notices in the chat or on our website for how to get involved. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Jonathan Tran. Jonathan teaches at Baylor University in Waco, Texas. His research focuses on philosophical theology. He's just finished a book on race and racism, trying to rethink how we think and talk about racism, what it is, and what liberation, especially for Christians, might look like. It's an honor to have Jonathan with us today. Do please put questions in the chat, and I'll do my best to incorporate some of them as Jonathan and I are talking. Jonathan, very simple first question. Who are you?
Well, first, Sam, thanks for having me on Heart Edge and for the work you all have been doing. We've heard about it from across the pond, so it's a pleasure to be with you and your community. I am a philosophical theologian in Waco, Texas. For those who have little idea of what that means, we're in the central part of Texas, what's often referred to as the heart of Texas, which if you catch the acronym there, it's entirely appropriate, HOT, because it is hot for long periods of the year. So Waco, Texas is a really great place, not a place my family and I ever thought we would end up. I grew up in Southern California after having immigrated to America from Vietnam after the American War with Vietnam ended in '75. So I came to Christianity rather late in life, right before college. And I think for me, the question then and continues to be whether any of it is true. And for me, the evidence for whether it is true is whether the church ends up being what scripture portrays it being. That is, if the church is the Spirit's work in the world, then the church should look like what scripture seems to suggest. And so, of course, if that's my evidence, then you might imagine I go back and forth on this question. Yeah, so to me, the faithfulness of the church is where the rubber meets the road for me on any number of questions I take up as a philosophical ethicist.
So could I take you back then to Vietnam, to be a Vietnamese person living in America? Now I guess you'd call yourself a Vietnamese American. It's not like being a Canadian American. I mean, it's not a happy history between the two countries. What's it like to have that dual identity when that identity has been so scarred by a war that America still doesn't feel able to talk about because it wasn't a success for America? It's not quite clear if that's the Vietnamese fault or the Chinese fault or the Americans' fault.
Yeah, it's a really great and deep question, both for me and for America. I mean, as you know, the American War in Vietnam is effectively the first war that America, quote, lost. And if you look at American history, it's largely told by its history of wars, the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, the 2 World Wars, and 2, those wars are all ones that America won. And so it's a story told through war, and it's a story told through war victory. Well, then how do you continue to tell the story of America, especially if those various accounts of victory had something to do with freedom, when the war you've lost is often told through the stories of atrocity? How does that fundamentally shift how Americans understand themselves? And that's, I think, the great challenge that the war presented to Americans. If you look at the really interesting history, for example, if any of your viewers have been to Washington, D.C. and seen the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, it's an extraordinary memorial. mainly for its ambiguity. It's not only architectural ambiguity, but it's moral ambiguity. What is it saying? It exists as a kind of literal scar in the earth. So how do we tell that story? The contested history around that memorial, I think, reflects the contested story of Vietnamese Americans. What do we represent to America? Do we represent its failure, its imperial ambitions? Do we represent its redemption, insofar as that following the war, America, it's still largely not understood why this happened, but America decided to allow 120,000 Vietnamese refugees into the country, my family among them. And I could tell growing up that Americans had no idea what to do with me or my family, just as they had very little idea what to do with the war. Do we represent a moment of redemption insofar as I'm here, or do we represent a moment of failure? And I think that set of questions really opens up a much larger set of questions about the moral character of this country.
I wonder if you could say a bit more about the kind of options available to the families of those 120,000 immigrants over the last 40 odd years, 45 years, is it? Excuse me. So, for example, I don't know if we've never talked about siblings, but if other members of your family and those in your wider family circle or the other people that you've been aware of who are part of that generation, what were the set of options? I mean, it seems superficially you've gone to college, you've done a PhD, you've become a professor, you've taken a certain route, you've become a Christian, arguably you've gone native, you've taken on the American thing. I imagine there are other options for people of your generation who've gone in very different directions from you. Could you give us a sort of sense of what the range of options has been?
Yeah, not only have I gone native, I love that way of putting it, but in some ways, I'm the model of what it means to go native. In and we can talk about this a bit more later, but in the American context, Asians, and I realize in the British context, Asian usually refers to what Americans call South Asians or the Indian subcontinent. In America, it covers the subcontinent as well as all the way to East Asia and Southeast Asia. Well, in America, I might very well fit, given that narrative you just offered, which I think is extremely accurate. I might very well fit what's been called the model minority. I'm not only a minority, but a picture of what it means well, a picture of how minorities should be. We come to this country, we work hard, we keep our heads down, which means we don't complain, and we achieve levels of success like getting a PhD at Duke University. And you take that picture, and you're asking about the available scripts for other Vietnamese. That's largely the script that was presented to me, and largely the members of my family who are all college educated, pretty successful people. The reality is, it's a much more complex picture, as you might imagine. Southeast Asians are among the least college educated ethnic group in the United States. Cambodians have, I think, the lowest, or one of the low, Cambodian Americans have one of the lowest high school graduation rates among my peers and friends that are Vietnamese. I came over when I was 3. Now imagine someone that came over when they're 10 and that experienced war as a child in Vietnam. The experience of gangs, of drugs, of high school, dropping out of high school. These are pretty common narratives. These are not the stories that that get told when people think about Asian Americans. Americans would rather picture what they call the model minority. And so these other, what we might call minority reports, tell a far different story. And I think for me and my siblings, that was certainly the case. I think that was constantly an issue. For example, my family, my mom on my mom and father's side, they're really wealthy. They grew up in the North. When the communists took over, they became really poor, but they also had very little idea how to negotiate poverty. That wasn't part of their experience. And so when they came to America and they were poor, then these were tough days. One example is I moved 14 times before I got to high school. It was just in and out of various cycles of poverty. Um, but I will say this: I didn't become a Christian until late, right before I went to university. But the church was a significant presence in our family's life because one of the ways the US government figured as a way to assimilate Vietnamese migrants was to put them in churches. And so the Episcopal Church, our Church of England, the Methodist Church, the Presbyterians, they all adopted um, Vietnamese migrant families. And so our family was adopted by a Lutheran family. And I got very little out of that experience. I was just too young. But one thing I do remember is this is a tough story, Sam, but I'll share it. It's a bit triggering, so I should say that as well. So my first memory in life was when I was about 5 years old. We had been in the country just a couple years, and my brother David and I were crossing the street, and he was hit by a car and was killed. Um, you can imagine kind of an extraordinary first memory. But the other thing I remember about that is the church coming around my mom and my immigrant family, who I'm sure they shared very little, even very little language, but their presence to our family. And it's, I think, those kinds of things that even if I couldn't put much of it together then, it certainly became part of the witness of the church that made me think maybe there is something here. So that became a very different kind of script into America.
Hmm. Well, you said some fascinating things at the beginning in terms of for you, it's the credibility of Christianity is always in question, and that stands or falls on whether the church is what the New Testament describes it potentially being. When Michael Curry, presiding bishop, uh, was joined our conversation a couple of months ago, he was very clearly about one thing only: Jesus. So in that sense, you could say that's what Christianity is. It's about the figure of Jesus and the power of that figure uh, down 2,000 years. And he used an interesting phrase that, when a church strays too far from Jesus, you've got to ask yourself whether you can really call it a church. I couldn't possibly imagine what he was referring to, but I think others on the call had a sense of what he might have been referring to. But your description in some ways could be called churchianity. I mean, it places the church in a very central role, and on the credibility of the church stands or falls the credibility of the faith. Could you unpack that a little bit for us, and how you came to that position, and given how unfashionable it is in the light of the publicly known shortcomings of the church?
Yeah, and I would follow Bishop Curry in saying that the centrality of our faith is the second person of the Trinity, Christ. But the material reality of that expression is the church in continuing Christ's witness. And of course, as you well know, theologically, different churches parse this out in different ways, how we locate the presence of Christ in the community called the church. It may be simply for me that I grew up outside of Christianity, or while there's a fair amount of Catholicism in Vietnam, that wasn't kind of our culture as a family, and I grew up in a world where it was completely devoid of divinity. There was the church, the Lutheran Church, in the first couple of years, but they didn't play that kind of imaginative role for us. The kind of default position was no God, and so for me, I think that what that sets up is that once I entered into the church, that's constantly in negotiation, God versus no God. And for Christianity, the claim of God being in Christ is materially articulated through the church. In the same way we want to say whoever God is shown to us through Christ, we would also want to say whoever Christ is shown to us materially through the sacraments of the church. I think Christians um, tend to want to play loose with that connection. And I think I can imagine why, because the church is often pretty horrible. Then philosophically, it's easier to say, well, of course, what I really mean is Christ. And they divorce that connection in a way that I don't think can be divorced. Or maybe a better way of saying it is, it doesn't seem to me in the New Testament that that's a divorceable reality. Those are materially connected. And I think what this does for the church is to remind us that no matter how bad we can be, the undergirding of our lives, the very structure of our existence is Christ. And so we always have the capacity to be better than we are. I think what I've just said sounds like an indictment on the church, right? It's to say something like, if we're not faithful, it's not clear that Christ exists. I think a more positive way to think about the same formula is to say, insofar as Christ undergirds us, we always have this capacity to express what God through the Spirit is doing in the world. It's always at hand. It's a matter of laying claim to that revolution.
So could you say, in the light of that, baptism becomes a very significant threshold, because that's the threshold by which we pass from the world into the church, in some ways, not that we leave the world, but that in terms of our identity, it becomes crucial. And I wonder if you could, begin to connect for us where that question of identity then leads into the territory that you've been working in more recently in terms of race. Could you explore how, a theological account like you've been giving of Christ and the church, how then that moves into what our most profound identity really is?
Yeah, I would think that would be the question that follows. If I'm trying to resist too easy a division between Christ and the church, then I'm trying to push those back together or to imagine them always being together, then the question of the particular Christian's place in the church becomes hugely significant. At least in the American context, though I imagine this form of kind of Protestant evangelicalism is quite popular in the UK as well. um, People often think that what baptism has to do with is simply my own individual salvation. And so, insofar as I've been saved, I've been baptized. That is no doubt part of the theological tradition as read through Scripture, or the scriptural tradition as read through theology. But it's also the case that what baptism marks is one's communal belonging. The way I think about it is to say that we are saved and our salvation looks like something. It's the life that baptism initiates. I rather think of baptism as an intensification of what nature already always is. Creation already participates in the life of God. And so, what baptism does is intensify and illuminate that for the individual. It's to say to the individual, uh, you belong with what God is doing in the entire universe and saving the world. Um, and it's not so much that your life ought to reflect that. It certainly should. It's simply that it does, insofar as you've been baptized. Um, One of the things I really am interested in pressing theologically is the idea that the Christian faithfulness, while it's an impossible task, right? It's losing our lives to follow Jesus. It's also the most natural thing we do, insofar as we are creatures. God made creatures through God's grace, and so to live into that is the far more natural thing to do. It's sin that's artificial. It's disobedience. We ought not think that giving our lives for God and for others is somehow a strange thing. It's the most natural thing we could do. It's what it means to be creature, to kind of reflect the gift structure of our lives.
Thank you. It's beautifully expressed. I wonder if I could then, and this isn't meant to be a trick or anything, but I then want to ask you a question I've already asked you. Who are you? And whether that question, whether you would now give a different answer 20 minutes into the conversation than you gave when you were introducing yourself to an audience who didn't, perhaps know you already. But in the light of what you've just been saying about Christ and the church and baptism, and perhaps in the light of the whole debate about race, could you give us perhaps a different answer that incorporates what you've just been saying? or
I love
would you give a different answer?
I love tricks, Sam, especially tricks that help me be better than I am. I would say I'm a Christian, and I think what that means is my whole life depends on the church being what Scripture says. Um, I can never claim this about myself, though I have friends who are faithful in these kinds of ways. But I would like to think that what my life as a Christian means is what Paul says it means, to live in such a way that if resurrection isn't actually the fact of human history, then I've lived a foolish life. I would like to at least think I've inclined in that direction, though, with all fits and starts along the way.
So you didn't say Vietnamese American.
This is a great question. I end the book by thinking about what racial identity comes to for Christians. We live in a time where racial identity is a kind of re-essentialized identity. It's supposed to tell you and your audience and your community the be all and end all of who I am. It's certainly a part of who I am. That I've been racialized as an Asian American in a particular context. But what that means is highly ambiguous per the nature of race itself. But I am most fundamentally a Christian. Now, I'm a Christian in a very particular context, and that particular context matters for the work of the Spirit in my life and the communities around me. But it's much easier for me to say I'm a Christian, not a particularly good one, than I am able to say what it means for me to be an Asian American. That's part of what I'm trying to press us to think about, whether we think racial identity is as easy as we tend to think, that we can carry as unproblematically as we want to.
So that leads us to the project you've been spending the last few years on, that is pretty much about to be brought forth when your new book is published in a couple of months' time. Could you tell us what started you on that project, and perhaps a little bit about the particular perspective you bring to that, because particularly in the light of the George Floyd killing and the Black Lives Matter movement, there's clearly been a lot of visibility and discourse around being African American. But where would a Vietnamese American line up in the light of that heightened discourse? But do you feel that discourse is about you?
Yeah, it was my increasing sense that it wasn't that made me begin to ask some bigger questions, some more difficult questions. I mean, I've been committed to issues of race and race reconciliation, diversity, and anti-racism my entire life. I had to be. I grew up in a time that racism was not only accepted, it was expected. I mean, you walk down the street and you would get it, from whomever, whether it be white folks or other folks. I would just be constantly told I was a chink or a Jap or, and it didn't matter. It didn't serve anyone by saying, well, I'm not actually a chink because I'm not Chinese. That missed the point. It was just constant racism. Um, and so I've always been kind of committed to this, mainly as a form of survival or a way of at least making sense of my own existence. A few years ago, I was asked to write a book on American racism and Christianity from an Asian American perspective. Right. And the proper way to do that would be to take the reigning discourse around race and racism and just expand its edges a little bit to include people like me. There would be a similar project, say, for someone in America that is what we refer to as Latinx, say Mexican American. The idea is you take the standing concepts and ideas of what race and racism are, and you just expand it a little bit. You diversify the common discourse. What I realized as I kind of drilled down on the literature and thought more honestly about my own experiences was increasingly the sense that anti-racism marginalizes those already marginalized by racism. And not only that, but the discourse in America, and I think this is true also for England, because I've read a bunch of the literature on both sides, is that, there's a way of talking about these things that presumes that a certain way of thinking about race works for everyone. You just expand out the categories. I found that to be painfully untrue. And not only that, but that there's ways that this worked out politically, that the more we committed to the way we talked about race, the more people like me simply would not matter. And if we did matter, we would always matter in a kind of secondary way. So that was part of the realization that there's something wrong, but that wasn't the primary problem. The issue for me wasn't trying to get greater representation for non-white or non-black people. The bigger issue for me was whether that way of thinking would ever get us very far. If the goal of anti-racism is something like liberation, um, I found that discourse was just going to further put us into the corners that we are currently in. And these corners, at least in the American context, are becoming increasingly and intensely bifurcated along issues of race identity. And so my goal was to think outside of this or beyond it or through it, by rethinking what we mean by race and racism. And it's, as you can imagine, it's a massive project. The book is, it's unfortunately going to be very long. But it was the attempt to kind of step back, get behind the curtain, and look at how we've gotten to where we are, and to look at what remaining resources are available. I think one way I'd like to put it is that what I've tried to think about is race and racism are extraordinarily complex realities. Do we have the moral vocabulary, the sophistication of our concepts and arguments sufficient to taking it in and to pointing to paths towards liberation? This is where Christianity really matters to me, because it has a very sophisticated moral vocabulary. It can think about these things in ways that can help us expand our imagination in thinking through these questions.
Now, I know you did quite a lot of ethnographic research. You spent time in a couple of communities in different parts of the United States to find out what their experience had been and still is, in particularly one case, I think. And now I'm going to ask the cruel question, which is probably the examiner's question if this had been a thesis or something. Did you start off with all the theory and find that the on the ground experience backed up the theory, or did you go and spend time in these communities and then develop the theory from there?
I mean, the ethnographic, I did I'll say a bit more about this, but I did a bit of oral history and a bit of ethnographic study. Um, I mean, the narrative I just offered was one where the theory already had kind of was collapsing under its own contradictions. To think about race as a phenomenon between, say, Black and white people, as it's almost entirely thought about in America, is to collapse under its own contradictions. And certainly, say, the British context in relationship to the US context, or in my context as an Asian American, the trans-Pacific, the transnational, already puts enormous pressures on that conceptual apparatus. But we are wedded in America to what's called the Black-white binary. And what I was trying to do is to try to get behind that and to try to figure out why that's the case. I mentioned to you earlier, it's interesting, I'm on with your audience this week, given all that's happened with the royal family, and at least as it's been treated on this side of the Atlantic, around the racism that was discussed in the interview, and then that's come up since then. And I read a comment this morning from your Prince William that the royal family most certainly isn't racist. And I think about how this usually unfolds. It's a similar kind of story recently. There's an American basketball player who was caught on a hot mic moment where he was kind of yelling out these racist slurs about Jewish folks. Or you think about the trial of Derek Chauvin, who was the man who killed George Floyd, or part of the group of men who did. And when we think about it in these narrow terms, the question is going to be, well, is the royal family racist? is Derek Chauvin racist? Is this basketball player racist? And then we enter into a kind of set of procedures. That is, we try to trace out the evidence for the racism. We look at their Twitter feeds. We look at what kinds of things they read online, the kinds of things they've said, with this idea in our mind that if we can search out the core racism, as if racism exists as a kind of box inside our head, then we can say they're definitively racist. Whoever made this comment about Megan, about the skin color of her children, if we can find that person, I find this to be, is there something that's awful about questioning the color of a child's skin? Absolutely, it's morally horrendous. But this is too narrow a set of questions. Instead of asking the question about is and who is the individual racist and how far can we trace it back, we need to ask much bigger questions about the structures and systems that benefit from racism. I find it's helpful to ask people to ask themselves a simple question. If it's almost universally agreed upon at this point that racism is bad, why does it persist? This is right. We would like to think it's a matter of kind of tracing down people's internal racist intents and ideas, that somehow the racism in the UK and the United States and all across the world somehow is the function of people having bad ideas, poor education about people of other colors, and so on and so forth. That is entirely too convenient a story. Of course, it's easy to think that what happened with Officer Chauvin was he had a racist intent and he went to that work that day to kill a black man. A much harder conversation to ask, why do we think using police and prisons is going to help us with our problems of extraordinary inequality and injustice in this country? That's a much more difficult conversation to have. Much easier to scapegoat this person and to place on top of him and these other three officers the weight of American racism. The reality is we have structures and systems that go back hundreds of years that racism helps facilitate. It justifies it. In my understanding of what racism is racism is the justification we use to justify our dominative modes of exploitation that have not only been there at the beginning of the US experience, but very much birthed the US experience. If you look at the structures of chattel slavery, this was a process by which we thingified human beings. Now, sometimes we say something like this, and this is again part of the problematic, overly convenient way of thinking about things. We say, well, Americans, or say the British, enslaved Africans because we were confused. We didn't think they were human. And in that confusion, we accidentally enslaved them. We knew fully well enslaved persons were human. We lived with them. The entire structures of American chattel slavery were predicated in the deep humanity of slaves. It wasn't that the tragedy isn't that we made a kind of category mistake and we treated those who are human as less than human. The tragedy is that we dehumanized those we could not fail to know were human in every way a human being could be human. That's the tragedy. That's a much more difficult moral reality to come to grips with. Just like thinking about George Floyd, it's much harder to think about the structures and systems that led to his death. Much easier to scapegoat. And so we need a much bigger story than the ones we tell about race and racism. If you think about these bigger stories, then questions like, is the Queen racist? Is this basketball player racist? While those are important questions, you can imagine how they become diversionary. They divert our attention from the structures and systems we need to address because we turn to kind of narrow stories about racial identity and individual racism.
So you've given us a backdrop of the pathology beautifully and brilliantly. The heart of your work in this book is about positive examples of how to live a true identity. Could you tell us about the community where you spent a good deal of time because it's a story I think we need to hear.
So the book is divided into two large segments of kind of empirical studies or actual studies of actual communities. The first one takes place in a really amazing history about Chinese migrant workers who were brought to the South, the American South, after the Civil War, the period known as Reconstruction. Now, you all know that the Chinese and subcontinent Indian folks were being brought to the UK, the West Indies, the Caribbean for many years as experiments in indentured labor. So these Chinese folks were brought to the South to replace emancipated slaves, namely the cotton industry that existed between Manhattan, Mississippi, and Manchester. Right, the UK and the US's kind of economic dominance relied on very, very, very cheap labor after it previously relied on very, very, very able forms of enslavement. And so the Chinese were brought there. They caught wind of what was happening. They refused those terms, and they built a life for themselves over the next 100 years in the deep South, what some people refer to as the most southern place on earth. And in the blues tradition is often referred to as the blackest place in America. The Mississippi Delta was the most important part of the cotton industry, as well as the birthplace for American blues and jazz. And those, of course, go together. Well, these Southern Chinese people they developed a business model. It became extraordinarily successful. They became the wealthiest Chinese Americans in the country. And incidentally, they became the most per capita Christian. And what I look at is the way the Christianity feeds their business practices, which are directly exploitative of their Black neighbors. So that's the story on the negative account of how the Christianity feeds into the racial violence, or what I say in most cases, where it just fails to do any work. Christianity is so divided from our material life. I interviewed a bunch of these folks. I read tons of archival histories, and not once can you see one instance of a Chinese American Christian who goes to church being taught in a Southern church that racism had much to do with Christianity, much less did their business practices have anything to do with it. So the much more positive side is the second half of the book, where I visit, and this happened during COVID, so I was able to kind of be online with them many, many hours each week. Is this extraordinary church in San Francisco called Redeemer Community Church. It's a church that was founded about 20 years ago by a number of college grads, a number of whom graduated from Stanford University, one of the most elite universities in the country. These students, as students in InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, which of course started in the United Kingdom, they learned about racism and poverty and about Christian responsibilities along these lines. They learned through the American evangelical civil rights worker John Perkins about redistribution, relocation, and reconciliation, and they gave their lives to lives of economic sharing. Now they did have their Stanford brains, and so what they've done there is they've not only created this church, which is a multiracial church, multi-generational church, but the software people quit their jobs and created a software company with the sole purpose of creating a company that would redistribute monies. In the same way the tech industry across the world has led to revolutionary changes in how we do business, how we do technology, how we do intersocial relationships. They thought, how can we harness that same ability to resource local communities and neighborhoods? And so they created a company that's called Dayspring Partners. And they have these very amazing practices inside their company. For example, in the US, at least, the CEO in top companies makes on average 287, I believe, times as much as the median worker. That's not the lowest worker, just the median worker. At Dayspring, the CEO is committed to never making more than 3 times the lowest paid worker, including the custodial staff in their company. This creates a much more humane work environment, given much more to kind of democratic forms of governance. But the other thing they do is they redistribute the money they make in the local community. And so you're talking about a software company that the money it makes, it tries to relocate it in one of the most impoverished, marginalized parts of San Francisco. And the third thing they've done is they've created a school. The sole point is to educate the kids in the neighborhood, which, because it's marginalized, tend to be African Americans, Latinx kids, and very, very poor Asian immigrants. The average salary, I mean, the average tuition for a private school in San Francisco is quite high, as you can imagine. I think it's near $50,000 per child. They're able to educate kids in their neighborhood for $2,100 a year. It's basically a way for a local parent to buy into it. They do this by redistributing income. And none of this is particularly novel to the way the church works. That's what's really amazing about it. The church has always been a redistributive economy. Acts 2:6, right, is always about the Spirit gathering of people, Christ redistributing grace for a graceless world, or one that's been given to sin. And with that redistribution of grace and salvation comes a material redistribution. These are one-to-one correlations, kind of what we were talking about earlier. And so it's an amazing church community. And one of the things I want to say in the book about this community is that most of us on the outside are going to look at what's amazing about the church is what it's doing with its kind of microeconomic practices, or what it's doing in the neighborhood with the school. What's really important about this church is that everything it begins with its communal life, with worship, with the church and the liturgy, things that you and Stanley Hauerwas have been on about for a couple of decades now. This is where it begins. It's this communal life of committing to one another, of being accountable to one another, of being intentional about who I hang out with and how I spend my money, how I think about people who are different than me. It's this kind of baseline communal reality that is really the beginning of everything else they do. And that's what I think I mean by laying claim to what is already there. The structures of reconciliation are built both into creation as a kind of form of self-repair, but have also been brought again more powerfully through Christ's ministry. And the Redeemer folks are simultaneously some of the most amazing human beings I know, and the most ordinary. They're laying claim to what is already there, what the Spirit is already doing.
So this is such a wonderful story, Jonathan, and such a Heart Edge story, because as I'm sure you know, Heart Edge, a lot of it is about bringing congregational life and commerce together and cultural life, and we need to sign these guys up. But I wonder if I could bring you back to a fascinating word you used earlier on, which is the word natural, because you kind of came back to that at the end of your remarks just now. And the reason I want to highlight it is because in certain discourses about race, there is a narrative going on that it is natural for races to be in tension, in conflict, that it is natural for, even, amongst supremacists, that for one race to lead, to take over, to be in mastery. But you're reclaiming that word natural to say that what Redeemer Community Church is doing in California is natural. Could you expand on that a bit?
Sure, and thank you for that question. So when I say that race and racism are justification for economic exploitation, what I mean is that you have systems of exploitation domination going on to make it seem natural. You put on top of those structures and systems, well, it's because that's who you are. I can enslave, right? I can enslave or exploit Chinese workers in the 19th century because that's who they are. There's something natural about them that gives way to this kind of exploitation. And so in a sense, it's a distortion of the natural. But it's just pure ideology. It's just lies on top of the structures of exploitation to give those structures a veneer of respectability. It's deeply unnatural to treat human beings this way. profoundly artificial. And only the ideology on top of it makes it seem like a natural thing. This is one of the things that we most have to claim at this point in our lives as humans, is that the structures of exploitation all across the earth that are clearly demonstrated in American chattel slavery, right, are systems of ideology that justify domination. The good news in that is that those who are exploited share something in common, right? It is a natural inheritance of all of us who have been oppressed by these systems to discover sightlines that, hey, we actually belong together in this. We're not going to believe the lies that tell us that there's something essential about us racially. That's what we need to resist. One of the things I try to argue in the book is that rather than thinking about racism in terms of racial identities, we need to think about what I describe as political economies, right? How everything hangs together and how race is situated in that. Only then will we see what's really happening to us. And only then will we find sight lines towards liberation. But as long as we remain committed to this racial identity that's been unnaturally imposed upon me, um, we're gonna be stuck in a kind of conceptual hole. Now, I am clear that I don't mean something like color blindness or post-racialism or any of these kind of silly notions. The problem there is that we have to keep sight lines of how the oppression has happened. And so we need to keep on the table some level of a notion or a theory of racial identity, but we have to be very careful about how we deploy it. So that's what's unnatural. What I mean by natural is in the book, I try to give an account of human creaturely ecology, right? The ecology is the zones of our existence. What are the natural orders of our existence? Well, the baseline of all creaturely existence is the Trinitarian life of God. All creatures exist then within ecologies within that larger ecology. If that baseline ecology is God's grace, and if the terms of that grace is translation in a sinful world is justice and mercy, then the most natural thing in the world is justice and mercy. They are natural to the world because God is the one who created the world. So to lay claim to God's grace, I mean justice and mercy, is to say this world belongs to God. And so in claiming justice and mercy, I'm not claiming some imaginative script that's being placed on the hard reality of the world. I'm laying claim to what is true about the world. Um, and so what I find beautiful about the Redeemer community is they participate in their church ecology between this church, the school, and the business. But that ecology exists also within an ecology of that part of San Francisco, Bayview, Hunters Point, which exists within a larger transnational ecology. But all of that exists in God's life. It is part of that system's order to depend on a larger ecosystem, which is God's life. And this is what I mean by natural. That's why racism is one of the reasons racism is such a destructive reality. It's a distortion of that natural ordering of things. It is to lie about how God has ordered the world. Why? Because people have made use of that in ways that created extraordinary structures and systems that benefit very few at the cost of the vast majority of human beings. And as we're learning now, as we've been learning over the last few decades, extraordinary cost to the rest of the earth. Rather, we need to lay claim to these kind of natural connections between us.
Now, people on the call may be wondering, so when Jonathan speaks this way, who could possibly disagree with him? There are people who disagree with you. Uh, could you locate yourself in relation to some of the debates and how you got yourself in hot water, and how you see a way through some of those debates?
Yeah, I mean, what I call in the book the kind of reigning orthodoxy is what I describe in, this is a terrible term, identitarianism. It's a mouthful. But basically what it means is people who construe the issue of race and racism in narrowly racial identity in terms of narrow concepts of racial identity. Let me give you an example. I gave you a few earlier in terms of trying to figure out who's a racist and who's not. Uh, in America, a huge issue, and I'm guessing this is the case in your context for sure, is the issue of gentrification. Um, and the story of gentrification is often narrowly told as a story about racial identities. In our context, white people moving in on Black people. Um, and if you tell the story this way, then it seems that the primary motivation for white people doing it is something about white people. They're evil, they're possessed of a term that's kind of in vogue in the US. They're possessed of their whiteness, some essential quality about who they are as white people that makes them want to do these things. Rarely does anyone, when they tell that story about gentrification and these racial personalities, rarely does anyone talk about how property relationships are managed in cities, about the relationship between local, state, federal governments, about how permits are negotiated. Rarely is the story about how low income families are set in systems where governments allow exploitative practices towards their employees. Rarely is the story told about the modes of political disenfranchisement between local forms of political organizing and state and federal forms of government. It all becomes about the race. Um, and for white people, it all becomes about them being white. Um, the whiteness description is an entirely too convenient way of describing this. Now, am I denying that white people are advantaged by the system? Certainly, I hope I'm not. But this cannot be narrowly understood as a whiteness system, right? It's something about whiteness. This is a system that's extraordinarily complex again, and we need to get to those complexities. Um, Race is certainly a huge factor in that, but it's, again, as I've described earlier, part of a larger political economic system, what the Black radical tradition has long called racial capitalism, the way capitalism and racism are absolutely intertwined with one another, as I've described it as one justifying modes of domination and exploitation. If we then step back, then we have to have this bigger picture. The people who would resist me on that claim. They would say, no, it has to do with something about white people, and it has to do with something about maybe a kind of almost primordial, almost right, existing above history form of anti-Blackness. I think the problem with that is it automatically, right, there's all kinds of problems with that conception. I get that into this book, but one practical problem is it already cuts off what necessarily needs to be a coalitional partnership between oppressed white people and all other people who are oppressed. We need to remember with the great theorist Du Bois, who said what poor white people were given was a psychological wage that distracted from the fact that they were being exploited. What was that psychological whiteness? Well, at least you got your white skin going for you. A diversionary tactic that introduced a divide and conquer strategy between exploited white folks and enslaved Black folks. It's the same thing you saw in the American history of the quote unquote Chinese question. It's certainly what the great Black theorist Cedric Robinson found in the UK when he looked at the early histories of 19th century exploitation among, say, the English, the Irish, the Slavs. He saw how race was being deployed to divide these folks. He knew automatically race then was not about biology. It wasn't a biological distinction, it was a labor distinction. He realized automatically that race is not about difference, it's about differentiation. Race is not about, say, diversity or diversification, it's about stratification. These are ploys that are used to divide us. And so what I think we have to push for, and this is most powerfully articulated in the Black Marxist Oliver Cromwell Cox, what he pointed to is what we need to do is look past the local forms of oppression and look for signs of solidarity and coalitional politics across the classes of oppressed people. That will be oppressed people in the United States and Latin America and Europe, Europe and Africa and Asia. These are the ways we begin a revolution, by looking past what is going to be the temptations And so those who would oppose what I'm saying worry about those kinds of questions. And they raise very significant and very serious questions. And I try to take these questions very seriously in the book. But I think what we're looking at in the alternative picture that I'm presenting, I think is a much clearer path to liberation. And it begins with forms of solidarity that cut across the forms of racial nationalism that tempt us.
So, ending as I guess we're going to need to do in a couple of minutes. Could you give us a vision, I guess, for the people on the call, for the people watching this at a later time, watching the video in weeks, months, years to come, of perhaps the inspiration that we could each draw from that Californian church, I guess, for how we can conceive of our engagement in church as a profoundly political and perhaps economic act. Could you, because I guess one of the most disabling parts of this narrative, particularly as heightened in the last 12 months, is a sort of white powerlessness, of a sense of perpetual guilt, but that can lead to a kind of paralysis. So could you
or virtue signaling,
or
it's the opposite, right? The idea is, go back to my earlier image, that we're trying to search out the racist and we're trying to find out the racist box inside that person. Well, what's the idea? Then the white person should project her anti-racism by various forms of virtue signaling.
Right.
And the guilt and the virtue signaling are just two sides of the same coin. What I deeply appreciate about the church in San Francisco is that their deep dependence on the Black church in San Francisco. They as they move towards what's called Black San Francisco, which again is increasingly Asian migrant communities, was they depended on the Black churches there. It was because of one of the pastors that had connected them to that community. And so everything was about, how do we belong in this place with others? And so there was always this sense that if we're going to make it here, we're going to rely on the gift structure of these relationships. And I found one of the people I interviewed, a Black pastor of a wonderful church called Shekinah Fellowship. One of the things he says is, what's so important about this church, Redeemer, mostly Asian Americans being in this community, is it teaches them about the suffering of Black life. And it's that being willing to be present, or as we would use theologically, Sam, the language of incarnation, that then they're able to see the sightlines, both the sightlines of oppression. What happens when you're only paid this much? What happens when local businesses are crushed? They're able to see those sightlines, but then they're also able to see the sightlines out to liberation. This partnership with this other church then builds out, right, into recognizing really what we need in this community, Dayspring Partners, is we need jobs, right? That's when Pastor Danny Fong, the founder of the profound realization, what we need, how we help is we create jobs. Certainly we need to think about our implicit biases and our racism and these kinds of things, but how do we create infrastructures that bring justice, right? This is not an easy equation, both in terms of the interpersonal, but also in these structures and systems, but that's where you begin. But I cannot say enough, the place where all this begins, right? I mean, a lot of my book parallels or tracks with Marxism, but here's a fundamental difference with us and Marxism. Right, Marxism, under the adage is, I'm going to wait for the revolution to start. Christians are not waiting for something to start. They're laying claim to something that started 2,000 years ago. And if we're right about the natural order of things that have existed eternally, we're laying claim to the most natural parts of who we are. So Redeemer, for all of its extraordinary brilliance of faithfulness, they're just doing what all of us can be doing. Certainly what Hard Edge is doing, right, with its emphasis on commerce and your local congregations, communities. My sense is this stuff is happening all over the world. But the way we talk about race and racism obscures these realities. But these are some of the most important things that we can possibly be doing. I would say the most important.
Well, I might almost say living God's future now, to use a very hard edge phrase. And Jonathan, you've diagnosed a problem in a way that I think for many people is a very fresh and energizing way that breaks through some of the disempowerment of the what you've called identarian um, diagnosis of what the racial issue. You've been very explicit about what you believe racism is and about the ways we can't be sentimental and just pretend it isn't there. But you've also given us profoundly constructive and deeply Christian and theological ways to navigate that, and a hopeful endorsement of the kinds of church that Heart Edge is trying to foster and bring about. I think once 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 lockdown is over around the world and we have a whip round, a bunch of people are going to be heading out to California to see how it's done. But also, I think they're going to be stopping at Baylor on the way to try and sneak into the back of some of your lectures, because I think you've shown what an inspiring vision you have for the church, for Christianity, for the world, and for the stuckness we have and the profound sadness we have around issues of racial difference and tension and exploitation. Thank you for a wonderfully inspirational hour together. Every blessing on your ministry and teaching work. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining with us. It's been great to have you on the call, and do join us again in a month's time for our next Living God's Future Now conversation on the second Thursday of next month, and for all the other Heart Edge program items that have been in the chat. Thank you very much indeed.
Sam, can I just jump in? We've had a question asking what Jonathan's book's called.
That's a very good. Go on, Jonathan. Give us a quick 30-second promo.
Oxford University Press and I are trying to decide that right now. Most likely it will be called Asian Americans in the Spirit of Racial Capitalism. I'll also put the link for the church in the chat for everybody.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, everybody. Have a good evening, or have a good afternoon, Jonathan.
Thank you.
Or even afternoon. It's only just afternoon with you.